Come to order. Welcome to America's Natural Solutions, the climate benefits of investing in healthy ecosystems. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. And as a reminder, members participating in a hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. For members participating in person, masks are optional as per the Office of Attending Physician. And as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. And as a reminder, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository to sccc.repository@mail.house.gov. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Without objection, Representative Bruce Westerman, the gentleman from Arkansas, shall be permitted to join the committee on the dais and be recognized for questioning the witnesses. So thank you all for joining this hybrid hearing. Today, we'll review the climate benefits of the investments made in ecosystem restoration and conservation through the Great American Outdoors Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We will also examine opportunities for further investment to create healthy and resilient habitats and communities. And I'll recognize myself now for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Again, good morning. This is a very important hearing, something that often goes overlooked. Nature provides us with critical low-cost tools to tackle climate change. And that's no April Fool's joke. Whether it's forests, grasslands, or mangroves, healthy ecosystems can help significantly draw down the heat-trapping gases that are fueling the climate crisis. Natural places also serve as vital defense structures, providing communities with a cost-effective buffer against worsening climate impacts. As Congress works to fast-track affordable clean energy, as we strive to address the rising costs of climate disasters, we also must invest in nature-based solutions that can help us meet America's climate goals and lower costs for Americans. Restoring and conserving our natural resources will be necessary to avoid permanent damage to the land that we love. So far this year, the number of fires and acres burned across America are nearly double the 10-year average, according to the National Interagency Fire Center. Sea level along our coastline is projected to rise up to 12 inches in the next 30 years, according to NOAA. And nearly 60% of the continental U.S. is already experiencing drought conditions. These climate impacts increasingly will harm important sectors of our economy, including agriculture, forestry, energy, and tourism. Unless we take urgent action, these industries will be permanently impacted by the climate-fueled loss of species and habitats, which is already taking place. Americans' lives and livelihoods are at stake. Investing in healthy habitats today will unlock incredible climate benefits for years to come. Thriving ecosystems remove carbon pollution from the atmosphere by acting as natural carbon sinks, and they can significantly help keep temperatures in check through the end of the decade. The same can be said for our bays, lakes, and ocean, which collectively absorb enormous amounts of heat-trapping carbon dioxide. Just in my community of Tampa Bay, healthy coastal habitats have the potential to remove about 74 million tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the end of the century, according to an analysis by Restore America's Estuaries. That's about the same as taking 15.5 million gas-powered cars off the road. Beyond these climate benefits, investing in healthy habitats also can bolster local economies. Ecosystem restoration projects often act as economic engines, generating local jobs in planning and engineering, manufacturing, construction, ag, recreation, and forestry. So we know it's important to source these jobs locally, and that we carry out these projects with each community's needs in mind, from planning to implementation to listening to disadvantaged communities and tribes. And over the past few years, the Congress has made good progress on conservation and restoration. With the Bipartisan Great American Outdoors Act, we made significant investments to enhance parks, forests, wildlife areas, and other public lands. In that bill, we permanently funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which supports recreation and conservation projects across America. And we established the National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Fund, which will address the maintenance backlog affecting critical infrastructure in our national parks and public lands. And then through President Biden's Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we devoted nearly $1.5 billion for coastal resilience and community-based restoration, and $2 billion for forest and rangeland restoration. It also includes permanent funding to restore national forests affected by wildfires and other events, as well as millions of dollars to restore fish passages, establish safe wildlife crossings, and protect our estuaries. But our work is far from done. We must be proactive and incorporate new projects. We must invest in capacity building to bring these solutions to every community. And we must work towards our goal of conserving at least 30% of all U.S. lands and ocean areas by 2030. Preserving America's unique natural heritage has broad bipartisan support. So I look forward to today's discussion. I'll yield back the balance of my time, and I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member for his 5-minute opening statement. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, today I would like to announce to my good friends that I've finally seen the light, that I am 100% on board with y'all's efforts to move to renewable energy. I'm going to switch parties, and
You're in sync with most of America now. Thank you.
So April Fools. When I talked about switching, I know somebody's going to chop that. Somebody's going to chop that. And just to finish my statement, when I was talking about switching parties, I'm going to switch from the Saturday night Mardi Gras ball to the Sunday night Mardi Gras ball. And when I tell you I've seen the light, I do want to clarify that. So we recently had the president, in fact, over about the last 4 months, announced that he's going to release a total of 260 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. According to EIA, we've imported up to about 200,000 barrels a day of Russian oil. So you can do the math. The president's saying he's going to release 1 million barrels. Even if you add refined product in, you're still significantly below that number. And to me, it verifies what we've expressed concern about previously, is that the release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, our emergency reserves, are actually to mitigate for bad energy policy. Madam Chair, you just made reference to the Great American Outdoors Act, and you're right, Congress did pass that, and I know there are a lot of people in this room that supported it. But I also want to remind you that every penny of that money that goes toward funding the national parks and wildlife refuges and our BLM lands and forest, and it goes to the maintenance of backlog maintenance, every single penny of that is derived from offshore energy production in the Gulf of Mexico. And so over the past year, we have seen, just in 1 year, we have seen, and I can get the exact numbers, but I was looking at some numbers just a minute ago. We have seen a reduction of over $1 billion, over $1 billion in revenue to the U.S. Treasury that would go to fund the Great Outdoors Act, as well as funding things like coastal resiliency and hurricane protection in my home state of Louisiana. And so there's a relationship here. If we continue, as this administration has done, to say we're not going to produce any energy, we're not going to produce it. The only administration in modern history that has not had a single lease sale for onshore or offshore energy in the United States. And so you're having financial implications. It's causing environmental concerns. It's making the people that we represent in South Louisiana along the Gulf Coast more vulnerable, because we're not making investments into hurricane protection and coastal restoration at the same level as we would, and it's going to be a downward trajectory. And so some say, well, look, I don't want to use oil and gas. Well, even this administration's Energy Information Agency says we're going to have a 50% global increase, 50% global increase in demand for energy. This administration's projections show an increase in oil and an increase in gas demand, as well as renewables and everything else we need to be doing. We've got to have a strategy moving forward. Madam Chair, you just talked about American support and the majority of Americans. You know what the majority of Americans have said? 92% of Americans, 92% have said that they don't want to import foreign oil, that they don't want to bring in oil from Russia. Yet this administration's policies are actually making us more dependent upon foreign resources. So what did the president do yesterday? He just says, well, we're going to employ the Defense Production Act and we're going to get these critical minerals. Well, just a few months ago, you actually banned critical minerals from being produced in the United States. The Defense Production Act, it really is designed for three things. It's designed for national defense. It's designed to respond to disasters. It's designed to respond to terrorism. It's really unfortunate that we're in a situation where we have to employ the Defense Production Act to address terrorism and disasters committed by our own administration. Look, we're talking about natural solutions today. And I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to hearing from witnesses because I think, Madam Chair, this is an area where we agree. I'm excited to have Congressman Bruce Westerman, the ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee, come in a little while. Bruce has been an incredible leader and very well versed on natural solutions, such as the role that trees can play in sequestering greenhouse gases. And as you may know, he's got this legislation, the Trillion Trees Act, that could sequester up to 205 gigatons of carbon through that initiative. But we also have other things that we ought to be talking about, and that includes our farms. Some of the largest landholders in conservation in the United States are farms. And in fact, since 1948, their productivity has increased over 280 times the productivity of our agriculture. And so that's more efficient farming, providing food to the United States and the world at a much more efficient rate. In fact, some of the most efficient production in the world. In fact, I think it's the most productive in the world. But we have additional opportunities to do better best practices and employ better, I don't know how to say that. Let me try that again. Employ best practices on a wider scale. And I think we can result through working with our farmers, other natural solutions. And one other thing, Madam Chair, that I want to make reference to that I think affects both of us is restoring or protecting our coastal areas. Because when we have our coastal areas erode and are lost, it results in the emissions of greenhouse gases. And in fact, when I was working for the state of Louisiana, we did one of the first clean development mechanisms in the world relating greenhouse gas emissions to wetlands restoration and protection. I think we have some opportunities there as well. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and yield back.
Now I want to welcome our witnesses. Today we'll hear from experts on the importance of investing in healthy and resilient habitats and communities. We have a great panel. Mr. Colin O'Mara is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Wildlife Federation. Mr. O'Mara leads the country's largest wildlife conservation organization with 52 state and territorial affiliates and nearly 6 million hunters, anglers, birders, gardeners, hikers, paddlers, and wildlife enthusiasts. Prior to NWF, Mr. Amar led the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and the Environmental Control as Cabinet Secretary from 2009 through 2014. Mr. Nick Loris is the Vice President of Public Policy at C3 Solutions. Mr. Loris studies and writes about a wide range of energy and climate policies, including natural resource extraction, energy subsidies, nuclear energy, renewable power, and energy efficiency. He also studies ways in which markets will improve the environment, reduce emissions, and better adapt to a changing climate. Dr. Sherry Larkin is the director of the Florida Sea Grant College Program and professor of food and resource economics at the University of Florida. As a natural resource and environmental economist, Dr. Larkin leads work to conserve coastal and marine resources and enhance economic opportunities across Florida. She has served as an elected member of the Executive Committee for the International Institute of Fisheries Economics and Trade, as well as president of the North American Association of Fisheries Economics. The chair now recognizes Representative Bonamici to introduce Dr. Christina Eisenberg.
Thank you, Chair Castor. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christina Eisenberg, an Oregon State University courtesy faculty member at the College of Forestry and an outstanding alumna and alumni fellow. Dr. Eisenberg is a Native American Latinx conservation biologist and the principal investigator on 2 multi-year projects within Indigenous communities. She served as a Smithsonian Research Associate and as the chief scientist at Earthwatch Institute, where she was responsible for overseeing a global research program focused on ecological restoration, climate resiliency, social justice for Indigenous peoples, and sustainability. Dr. Eisenberg has authored numerous journal articles, books, and book chapters. She serves on several boards and advisory councils. She works to help build government-to-government partnerships with tribal nations and federal agencies in a manner that respects sovereignty, upholds treaty rights, and advances social and environmental justice. I look forward to hearing more from Dr. Eisenberg, and I thank her for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Rep. Bonamici. And I'd also like to welcome a number of students who are in the audience today, graduate students. They're in town for the National Association of Graduate Professional Studies Spring Legislative Action Days. It's a pleasure to have University of Florida graduate student Rock Abujadi, who serves as Legislative Director of the Association and as Director of the Campus Climate Corps in Gainesville. Welcome also to Dr. John Capice, who has spent his career supporting graduate students and clean water in the great state of Florida. With that, Mr. Amar, you are going to start us off. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your presentation.
Good. Thank you, Chaircaster and Ranking Member Graves, for holding this hearing and for giving me the opportunity to testify before you all. To achieve net zero emissions, we're going to need to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. by about 6 gigatons, and domestically, and about 44 gigatons around the globe. We often think about natural climate solutions and natural solutions as a resilience play. But I want to talk today about how this could actually be these investments could actually be a quarter of the overall solution. They're kind of the ultimate win-win-win. They're a win on safety. They make communities more resilient. The healthy forests are less likely to experience mega fires. Healthy wetlands and grasslands help reduce damage from hurricanes and inland flooding. They're a win on carbon. They're a multiple gigaton solution for sequestering carbon. They're economic wins. They create a ton of good jobs, about more than 17 to 25 jobs per $1 million invested. They both direct restoration jobs as well as supporting jobs on working landscapes and the outdoor economy. Number four, the fourth win is that they make communities healthier. They, for example, urban trees, filter out pollution out of the air and the water. They reduce urban heat island effects. And the fifth win is that there's this huge savings. They save a ton of money. Every dollar we spend on pre-storm disaster preparedness saves us $6 to $8 of avoided cost. And that's an incredible ROI that is a great way to reduce our long-term debt. Yet despite all of this, climate conversations rarely focus as much on natural solutions as they do on technology, and it's less than 5% of overall climate spending. And when you consider that they're really the only emission reduction strategy that also provides resilience benefits that can cost effectively save lives, it even becomes more absurd that we don't focus on it more. Last year alone, we had 20 climate fueled disasters that caused at least $1 billion in damages. These disasters resulted in $145 billion of total damages and the tragic loss of nearly 700 lives in the US. Imagine how many of those lives could have been saved. And, when disasters, whether it's Hurricane Katrina or Sandy or Harvey or Maria, or the horrific fires out west, they disproportionately affect communities of color, low-income communities, frontline communities, first and worst. Now, when we think about natural climate solutions, we're talking about a few types of key systems. So we're talking about forests, we're talking about wetlands, we're talking about grasslands and shrublands, we're talking about coasts and the marine environment. Healthy forests are less likely to burn uncontrollably. Right? They help clean water, they help store water, they reduce drought conditions, they provide key habitat for wildlife, and they serve as our greatest terrestrial carbon sink. Wetlands and riparian corridors. The average acre of wetlands can hold more than 1 million gallons of water. 1 million gallons. The absorption capacity is huge. So when communities face a hurricane or a flash flood, those wetlands reduce both the volume and the velocity of water, protecting all of those either inland or downstream. Grasslands and shrublands, native grasses and shrubs have long, deep roots that sequester a lot of carbon, improve soil health, reduce soil erosion, all of which helps reduce flooding and improve productivity, especially when invasive plants like cheatgrass and buffalo grass aren't allowed to spread and kind of get that tinder on the landscape. Coast and marines, also huge opportunities for resilience and carbon abatement from living shorelines, planted dunes, tidal wetlands, mangroves, kelp, seagrasses, and other native vegetation. Each of these systems can mean the difference between life and death. Homes that are standing or communities that are washed away, life that's carrying on, or lives that are upended. Now, fortunately, as Chair Castor said, over the last several Congresses, and thanks to many of you, we've made great progress on natural climate solutions, especially resilience. We've gone from these being like niche projects to actually mainstream solutions. We've seen this in WRDA, the Farm Bill, the Great American Outdoors Act, the American Conservation Enhancement Act. We've seen natural infrastructure prominently focused in disaster supplementals. We've seen in enhancements to hazard mitigation programs. The Infrastructure and Jobs Act had historic investments, and the reconciliation package had $105 billion proposed for restoration and resilience. We can and must build on these investments and do so in ways that leave no community behind and ensure that communities of color and frontline communities are never an afterthought ever again. Now, the good news is that there is a whole range of bipartisan solutions that are before you right now. I'd argue that the biggest single action that Congress could take to spur private investment in natural solutions is replicating the success of the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture technology, and with a complementary credit that's actually focused on the sequestration of carbon naturally, sending a clear market signal that's predictable, accessible, additional, permanent, and ecologically appropriate. We could catalyze innovation and private investment onto public, private, tribal lands while providing a policy parity for natural solutions and their technological counterparts. If we want more greater public investment in through the Congress, and also reduce the long-term debt, we could update our way we budget these projects and way we score these projects. And our CBO right now will score the dollar we spend on mitigation, but not the $6 in spending in savings that we would enjoy. And we're spending a lot on supplementals that frankly are kind of that pound of cure, where the ounce of prevention would have been a lot cheaper. We also need to continue to prioritize natural solutions in things like WRDA, things like the next Farm Bill. All the ecological restoration programs, and not just like the estuary programs in the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake and the Delaware, but coastal Louisiana, the Everglades, coastal communities up and down the coast, and also the working waterways like the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, the Colorado, the Rio Grande, some of the resources that don't get the attention. And finally, I'd be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention the Recovering America's Wildlife Act and other great efforts like the North American Grasslands Conservation Act, the Wildlife Corridors Act, and hopefully there's a bipartisan path on the Trillion Trees Initiative. So these present a huge opportunity, and investing in natural infrastructure allows us to center the health and safety of people as we're also advancing our climate conservation economic goals. That's a pretty good win-win-win-win-win. Thanks for letting me be with you today.
And good job on getting summarizing your 30-page
voluminous
testimony in 5 minutes. So thank you very much. Mr. Loris, you're now recognized to give a 5-minute presentation of your testimony.
Thank you. I think Colin said double what I can say in the same amount of time. So, but I echo a lot of his sentiments. So I appreciate that. Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished members of the Select Committee, thanks for this opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Nick Loris, and I'm the Vice President of Public Policy at the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. C3 Solutions is a think tank that focuses on policy reforms to empower entrepreneurs and innovators to solve our greatest energy and environmental challenges. And with my time, I'd like to make 2 brief observations. The first is to underscore the economic, environmental, and climate benefits of investing in America's natural ecosystems. Active management of America's forests, grasslands, and wetlands will improve air and water quality, restore wildlife habitat, and capture and sequester more carbon dioxide. Forest restoration and eradicating invasive species will also reduce the risk of wildfires, floods, and droughts. Furthermore, innovative agricultural technologies and practices enable farmers and ranchers to produce more with less. The result is higher yields, cost savings, and healthier soils that prevent erosion and sequester more CO2. Without active care and investment, however, the mismanagement of America's ecosystems can increase greenhouse gas emissions and pollution, exacerbate the risks of extreme weather, and be an economic drain on communities. For instance, the 2020 wildfires in California emitted more carbon dioxide than the entire state's fossil fuel emissions that year. Addressing the fuel load through controlled burns and timber harvesting will reduce the size and intensity of wildfires and improve the health of America's forests. Another major challenge is invasive species, which devalue properties, damage infrastructure, devastate ecological systems, and threaten economic livelihoods. Whether it is cheatgrass increasing wildfire risk or zebra mussels compromising water infrastructure, invasive species impose significant economic and environmental harm. Allocating resources toward prevention, early detection, and rapid response are the most cost-effective solutions, as they prevent the invasive species from becoming too invasive. Harnessing the power of incentives is also an effective mechanism to reduce invasive species. For instance, the nutria is a semi-aquatic rodent that adversely affects wetlands and vegetation in Louisiana and several other states. Through a federal state program, participants can hunt and trap nutria and receive $6 per nutria delivered to a collection center. Another example is a resource incentive, where Florida's Fish and Wildlife Service provides a permit to harvest 1 additional spiny lobster for every 25 lionfish captured. The state also held a contest to see who could capture the most lionfish, and last year participants collected more than 3,400 in total. These collaborative relationships that utilize incentives are an effective tool to reduce and ideally eradicate invasive species. The second point I'd like to underscore is the importance of reducing or removing barriers that obstruct or delay investments in healthy ecosystem. These projects frequently run into burdensome, time-consuming permitting challenges. In addition, conservation projects can be held up for years in litigation. The significant loss of time to actively thin forests or eradicate invasive species often causes much worse environmental and climate outcomes. Rather than have pragmatic evaluation of risks and trade-offs, environmental reviews have too often devolved into a tool to stunt the development of cleaner infrastructure and delay projects that will restore America's ecosystems. To be clear, environmental reviews are a critical part of any project, as is the participation of the public and the communities affected by that project. Modernizing permitting is not about removing environmental safeguards, but increasing accountability and improving efficiency. Permitting reforms will allow preventative and restorative ecosystem investments to occur more resourcefully. Streamlined permitting will stretch taxpayer dollars further and inject more private capital into natural climate solutions. Federal agencies, states, the private sector, and nonprofits will be able to tackle our backlog of environmental priorities with more urgency and efficiency. With respect to agriculture, pro-growth tax policies will incentivize investment in new farming technologies and equipment, and leveraging Department of Agriculture programs to provide technical assistance for farmers and ranchers who want to pursue regenerative and precision agriculture will improve soil health and better optimize seed planting and treatment application, which will reduce the use of fertilizers, pesticides, fuel, and water. In conclusion, investment in healthy ecosystems is smart economic and climate policy. Rehabilitating forests, preventing and eradicating invasive species, promoting sustainable agriculture, and encouraging responsible land and water use practices will result in better ecological health, will reduce emissions, and will build up natural resiliencies to a changing climate. Natural climate solutions and healthy ecosystems will not come from treating America's lands and waters as if they should be stored behind glass in a museum. Instead, they require active attention, investment, and management. Policies and regulations should reflect those needs. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, Dr. Sherry Larkin, you are recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee. Thank you for your willingness to hear of new solutions to address the impacts of climate change, solutions that improve our coastal habitats, strengthen our communities' ability to withstand sea level rise, and increase America's blue economy that NOAA estimates affects 127 million people that live in coastal counties, municipalities, and parishes, or 40% of the US population. In 2018, America's blue economy supported 2.3 million jobs and contributed $373 billion to the nation's gross national product. In Florida, the share of the economy that is driven by our coastline is well above 40%. It is over 75%, making climate resilience intertwined with our state's future. My name is Sherry Larkin, and I'm a professor in the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida, and I'm the director of the Florida Sea Grant College program. Florida is one of 34 university-based programs in states that border the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the Great Lakes, Gulf of Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Science helps us understand how much our environment reduces the economic impact of climate change. It is now time for us to partner fully with that environment to improve the resilience of our coastal areas. In fact, in the recent Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act, NOAA was awarded $1.5 billion for coastal resilience related work, and FEMA was awarded $3.5 billion for flood mitigation assistance. This is just 1.3% of the annual contribution of our coastline to our economy. Sea grant programs are charged with not just funding science relevant to local stakeholders, but ensuring that those findings are communicated to the public and used by resource managers in coastal communities. Every dollar of federal investment in sea grant must be matched with non-federal funds, which is a model that fosters collaboration. The Blue Carbon Initiative indicates that 83% of global carbon cycle is circulated through the ocean, and coastal habitats account for half of the carbon that is stored in sediments. That means there is an opportunity to invest in coastal habitats, which account for less than 2% of the total ocean area. Just think of how big our blue economy can grow. In Florida, some of our activities in this space include restoring coastal seagrasses, mangroves, sponges, corals, and sea oat habitats, improving coastal water quality by helping divert boat sewage to clean marinas, and removing plastics from oyster restoration projects, building the capacity of local agencies, institutions, and associations to apply for federal funding, and improve FEMA's community rating system scores for reduced flood insurance premiums. We train shellfish aquaculture farmers and offer certifications for marine contractors to build living shorelines. We create public education programs like climate smart Floridians, seagrass safe boating, and mangrove trimming best management practices that help residents live more sustainably. Investigating regulatory revisions that would allow shellfish growers to supply seafood and be used for coastal restoration is particularly needed in Florida. We're building climate alliances in the Gulf of Mexico region to improve justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion with respect to health outcomes in the southeastern US and Caribbean. The reality is that to generate societal benefits, a lot of pieces need to be in place other than just habitat restoration. Namely, number one, site-specific research that quantifies the net carbon benefits, estimates the feasibility and value of alternative solutions, and evaluates proposed policies. Number two, education to encourage careers in natural coastal solutions and for homeowners, policymakers, and relevant industry sectors. And number three, training and workforce development to grow a new blue economy that benefits all Americans. As Sea Grant supports students and connects to the public through boots on the ground outreach, we believe we can create a grassroots movement, which is why I was delighted to learn that several graduate student leaders with the Campus Climate Corps were planning to be in front of you today. And if we don't embrace the opportunity now, the blue economy could leave America behind, and especially the underserved, even perhaps further behind. Finally, I wish to thank the network of Sea Grant programs nationwide and all of our unrecognized government and NGO partners, since we really do none of this alone. I appreciate the opportunity to share our collective vision regarding nature-based solutions and look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Larkin. Next, Dr. Christina Eisenberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony. Welcome.
I want to thank Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and the other members of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis for this opportunity to speak. To create ecosystems more resilient to climate change, including drought and other stressors, it is essential to partner with tribal nations and braid traditional ecological knowledge with Western science. Our Fort Belknap Indian Community Grassland Restoration Project in Montana exemplifies such work. Taking place on BLM land and Aning and Nakota tribal lands, funded by the Plant Conservation and Restoration Program lead Peggy Allwell, using Seeds of Success protocols. This project is sponsored by Oregon State University and the Society for Ecological Restoration. I am the lead principal investigator, and Thomas H. DeLuca, Dean of the Oregon State University College of Forestry, is the co-PI. The Fort Belknap Tribal Council, Tribal Historical Preservation Office, and BLM Montana Dakota's botanist, Wendy Vellman, oversee our project. TEK is knowledge and practices generated and passed down by Indigenous people across generations. We're applying TEK on the Northern Great Plains to improve ecological resiliency and restore degraded lands with native plants to increase wildlife habitat, productivity, and carbon sequestration potential. Incorporating TEK in ecocultural restoration empowers tribal nations. This matters because tribal nations in America are underserved communities with unemployment, poverty, and suicide rates far higher than US rates. Ours is also a high priority project because this prairie is a critical carbon sink and endangered by anthropogenic climate change. We deploy a tribal conservation corps of at-risk youth who collect the seeds of ecologically and culturally significant plants strictly protected by tribal data sovereignty. We're implementing the National Seed Strategy and Plant Conservation and Restoration Program by following Seeds of Success protocols to ensure a stable economical supply of native plant materials for public land restoration. We're collecting data per BLM assessment, inventory, and monitoring protocols to assess public lands. Maintaining healthy, sustainable ecosystems supports diverse land uses and benefits the National Public Lands Trust. Over the first 2 years of the project, fiscal year 20 and 21, outcomes include 45 jobs created, 94% of them for Native Americans. 39 of which were for tribal youth, totaling 15,000 hours of employment. We raised $200,000 in external and in-kind funding and collected 25 pounds of seeds for ecocultural restoration. Youth on our project have stayed alive and in school, and some have begun college. Beyond these tangible outcomes, during a Category 4 drought in 2021, I received a major lesson. On BLM land, I found ankle-height grasses in few places where plants had bloomed, their seed pods were hollow because the plants had suppressed growth because of the drought to survive. On tribal land, in the same ecological conditions, the grasses grew 4 feet tall with an abundance of seeds. This stark difference was unattributable to cattle. Both tribal and BLM lands were multiple use lands subject to cattle grazing, documented by our trail cameras. Kopiai Tom DeLuca, a soil scientist, and I will be looking at fire and other land management practices and their impacts on soils. Charcoal in the soil created by low severity fires set by indigenous people sustains soil carbon capital and increases nutrient availability and drought resiliency. When tribal lands were stolen and settled throughout the US, fires were suppressed. Indigenous burning is a key TEK practice and used globally to improve soil health. The next step is to create an ecocultural restoration plan with Fort Belknap that includes native seed collection, ethnobotany, and pollinator and soil health studies. The plan will contribute to the Fort Belknap Climate Change Program. We have applied for US Fish and Wildlife Service Grassland Conservation Program funding for this work. Ecocultural restoration partnerships can advance our national climate resiliency agenda. This requires building capacity with education and jobs in botany, soil science, entomology, forestry, and ecological restoration for Native Americans. OSU can deliver the necessary education in partnership with federal agencies, tribal nations, and non-tribal landowners. Together, we can empower tribal nations and help America meet the climate challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg, and thanks to all of our witnesses for your insightful testimony. And without objection, all of the witness testimony will be incorporated into the record. Now we'll turn to member questions, and I'll recognize myself for the first 5 minutes. Well, we know that wetland and forest and ecosystem restoration and conservation is critical to adaptation and mitigation over time, but it's also, as many of you highlighted, it's also vitally important to capturing carbon and sequestering carbon. Just a few weeks ago, the world's top scientists said we must act urgently to reduce carbon pollution. There is a rapidly closing window for us to avoid catastrophic impacts and the rising cost of the climate crisis. So I want to know how do we do that? What's working right now? The federal level, helping states and local communities, all in partnership. How do we make sure that we're getting the best bang for the buck, the federal dollar that we're investing in natural solutions to sequester carbon? And how do we prioritize, Mr. Amar?
I mean, over the last several, especially in the wake of several hurricane seasons in the last several years. I mean, at this point, we have such great evidence of kind of the projects that have been successful and the projects that haven't. There's a lot of, back in the Sandy package, a decade ago, there's a whole bunch of monitoring that was done to kind of look at like the health of these systems to kind of make the case that they are truly achieving the resilience goals and some of the carbon goals that we have. And I think it's just a matter of doing that kind of deep research in the early investments that are made. There's a huge opportunities in the bipartisan infrastructure package to look at the forest restoration projects, look at some of the grassland restoration projects, look at some of the flood abatement programs, and make sure that they're actually achieving the goals. And what we're finding is that they're cheaper, they're more durable, and they're achieve more co-benefits than a lot of the traditional man-made solutions. And there's some solutions where the natural makes sense, or some places where the structural makes sense, or some places where a blend does. But there's a lot of good data now that kind of shows the types of public infrastructure investments that really should prioritize natural investments, maybe over some of the last century solutions.
And Dr. Larkin, you're well versed in those partnerships. There are so many funding streams that come from federal initiatives down to state and localities. how are we being the most efficient and making sure at this urgent moment in time that those dollars really are going to the best projects to sequester carbon and to make our communities more resilient?
Thank you, Congresswoman Castor. That's a great question. And I think we have, like the previous speaker said, we have a lot of mechanisms to follow up and track. I think we do a much better job now of tracking and quantifying outcomes. The science has helped us progress to the point where we can actually get to the economic value of those outcomes. I do see a trend in terms of making more impact in these integrated calls for proposals where you're tasked to go out and have local boots on the ground, and you're tasked to bring different parts of the federal government together. So we often work not just within NOAA, but within projects with the Department of Defense and the EPA. And I think those funding mechanisms and those language that really charge us to go out and develop a network of partnerships are where you see a lot of the impact happening.
So we see it in partnership, for example, with farmers through agricultural extension. We see it in some of the land conservation programs, but Dr. Larkin, there are so many communities that just do not have the capacity to go and fight for the federal grants. What do we need to be doing to make sure that lower income communities, rural areas understand that they have a partnership and can access the investments and tools they need?
Oh, that's really good. First, I'd say, I think we're lucky that we sit with our land grant partners. So land and sea grant, we have those boots on the ground. I think in developing partnerships, well, so one thing, we go where the problems are, and we are not big enough to go out and reach out to every company. No agency is, or every organization. So we have to rely on training the trainer program, almost like where if we help one community, we help that community develop another community. I think when you look at the forced multiplier effect, for instance, or the notion of organic growth is we set some models in motion, that success breeds more success. And I think that's one area that we're most excited in because applying for federal money is not easy. So helping that capacity is definitely right. But when we help that capacity, help them with one grant, they will then have the capacity to go after the next one. So we really hope that grassroots will pay off in the long run.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Ms. Miller. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. West Virginia it's just so well known to be one of the most beautiful locations in the country, if not the world. In Southern West Virginia, we highly prize our environment, and we know that the beauty of our state lies both in our geography and in our abundant natural resources. I was proud to be a sponsor of the bill to designate the New River Gorge as our nation's newest national park. My community has seen a huge increase in the attention and in the tourism from so many Americans, as well as visitors from around the world who have had the opportunity to encounter West Virginia for the very first time. In fact, 600,000 more people visited the New River Gorge National Park this year than the year before. That's over 1.7 million people. I'm so proud of the abundant resources, the natural resources that my state have to offer, from the clean coal to the high quality oil and natural gas. We power the nation and the world, and we have provided a livelihood for so many people in our state. And I'm really proud of my neighbors who they're kind, loving, hardworking Americans who have been doing their best to get by no matter what our government tries to throw at them. Unfortunately, West Virginians know all too well that the government doesn't always offer the best solution. That's why I think it's so important to empower the private sector to get to work. Streamlining and permitting processes across a variety of sectors is something Congress could do right now to expand energy deliverability, expand opportunities of the timber development, and produce more right here at home while we're providing jobs and opportunities for many of my constituents. Mr. Loris, can you explain how the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA process, has become so burdensome over the last 50 years? And what can Congress do to help streamline the process?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The National Environmental Policy Act, is more than 50 years old, and certainly well intentioned and served its purpose. I think since then we've seen a number of federal environmental laws passed and amended, a number of state environmental laws passed and amended, and I think what the problem with NEPA is that it's become a tool to obstruct and delay or to challenge projects in court. And there's been a number of documented cases, particularly with forest restoration, for instance. A Property and Environment Research Center report in April of 2021 documented some really troubling ones where projects took years and years and are still held up in courts. And so the more we can have, again, an efficient permitting process that, again, still engages stakeholders, still engages communities, still allows litigation to happen, but be challenged and resolved more quickly, will allow for more of these projects to happen efficiently. I think there's several legislative ideas out there, Representative Graves with the Builder Act, Senator Mike Lee with the Unshackle Act, that would still have this environmental accountability and safeguards, but allow projects, again, not just for forest restoration and timber development, but also it will help with clean energy projects, more transmission lines, more liquefied natural gas exports, which are cleaner than Russian piped gas. This is one issue in which I've heard from people who are working on forest restoration, energy developers, manufacturers, all run into these challenges. And the quicker we can resolve this issue, I think the more we can act with urgency to provide economic and environmental benefits.
I agree. And in your testimony, you mentioned the possibilities that carbon offsets can provide to companies who are looking to reduce their carbon footprint. Could you explain in more detail some of the opportunities and challenges that are presented by the carbon offsets along with their effectiveness?
Yeah, I think these voluntary carbon offset markets can provide flexibility to engage with companies and nonprofits and entrepreneurs, a lot of climate entrepreneurs who are motivated by reducing emissions to ultimately reduce their environmental footprint and reduce emissions. And the people who are doing that will then get paid for it. So it's certainly a win-win. And I think there have been concerns about carbon offsets, primarily the validity of them, as well as, if a restoration project for forests or afforestation project happens and it burns down, what does that mean for the offsets? And there's been some challenges with validity, but those concerns, I think a lot of them have been alleviated by the work of the private sector, by nonprofits, in terms of we have better technology now. We can use drones and satellite imagery and better data to verify that these offset projects are happening. I think another concern is that the concept of additionality, which, are people getting paid for something they were going to do otherwise? And it's very difficult to prove a counterfactual there. But that said, I think the fact that carbon offsets provide this flexibility and market-based mechanism for some companies who have a very challenging task ahead to reduce emissions is something that results in more productive relationships. The more we can have the private sector taking the lead on that, which I think is what's happened, I think the better off we're going to be. I think the role for the federal government should be limited in ensuring that these are verifiable carbon credits, and to prevent things like the Chinese flooding the markets with fake credits. There is a role there, but I think it should be pretty limited.
Thank you. I yield back.
Rep. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, for holding this important hearing. And thank you to the witnesses for your expertise. In November, this committee held a hearing examining tribal perspectives on the climate crisis. I asked a question about the announcement from the White House Council on Environmental Quality and the Office of Science and Technology Policy about the administration's commitment to elevating Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in the federal policymaking process. Early last month, the White House announced that the administration will be developing guidance to lift up traditional ecological knowledge in federal decision-making. So Dr. Eisenberg, you have substantial experience with traditional ecological knowledge. What are the lessons learned and the best practices that should inform the development of this guidance?
Thank you for that question, Representative Bonamici. I was actually present at some of the meetings that you just mentioned, and I'm very actively involved with the process of providing guidance on how to use Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, as it's referred to by the scientific community. We need to have government-to-government relationships. That means tribal nations are not stakeholders. A stakeholder is a member of the public. Tribal nations are nations. And so that means honoring sovereignty rights in all aspects of our partnerships with them. Tribal nations very much, all the tribal nations I've worked with around the world want to partner with federal governments and nonprofits, but it needs to be decolonized, this process. So we need to all sit at the table as equals. TEK, it's our native science, but it is also a worldview, and it includes ethics. And so that everyone is equal, and the living world needs to be respected equally. And this is within the context of multiple uses. So part of the things that can help advance this is to integrate our cultures, our elders in all the conversations, and the White House is really leading with this. The White House Council on Environmental Quality, some of those meetings have been led by Secretary Haaland, and she really embodies these principles in her leadership style. Ultimately, what we want is a conservation corps of Indigenous people out on the landscape. Our TEK, our ecological knowledge, is the way our nation's lands, what is today the United States of America, have been managed for millennia. So all of our grasslands, all of our forests, all of our coastal ecosystems co-evolved with a large population of Indigenous people very actively managing those lands.
Okay,
In the
Dr. Eisenberg,
grasslands.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I really want to get another question in. We'll
Okay.
continue the conversation at another time, and I may ask you to submit more for the record because we have a lot to learn. Dr. Larkin, I'm the co-chair of the House Oceans and Estuary Caucus. I've long advocated for elevating the role of marine and estuarial ecosystems in adapting and mitigating the effects of climate change, because we know of the potential, which you of course have recognized, to reduce flooding, reduce the intensity of storms, sequester carbon, and generate good paying jobs. I do want to invite all of my colleagues on the committee and beyond to sign on to my bipartisan Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act. So Dr. Larkin, in your testimony, you cite training and workforce development as necessary components of an effective natural climate solutions toolkit. So what are the current workforce challenges you and your colleagues have experienced, and how can Congress help you close the gap?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So you're absolutely right. The training and workforce development is the key to our future as we try to draw new students in and develop new programs. I think one of our challenges is finding our partners. But the good news is, because these solutions can be implemented at the local level all the way up through the state level, the fact that we do have partnerships at every one of those levels, and with our state organizations, for us, it's the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And even as we try to develop programs that can be incorporated into our curricula, right? Start training students to think about these as careers moving up. How do we do that? Well, in high schools, in Florida, there's a curriculum process, and it's not necessarily easy to break into. So right now we're working on trying to help support the development of an aquaculture curriculum, because aquaculture, several different types of aquaculture. And how do we develop a curriculum around that so that the STEM courses in high school and those AP courses can use these examples as part of their learning tool, and maybe plant the seed that after high school, this is something I could do, or maybe I'll want to be a researcher and go on in my education. So I think it's interesting because that does take our state partners, it takes our local partners, and it takes the folks that are working in the area to really see what is that type of that project. You know, these projects are so site specific. We need theoretical and applied research at the site level, because what happens in one bay is so different than what happens in another in terms of the outcomes that we're going to receive. And that should really resonate with our workforce. So as we share our communications around the state, we really need to tailor them around the state to get the folks in the table to figure out which one of these workforce programs might work best for you. We can't.
Thank you, Dr. Larkin. I see my time has expired, and I really appreciate your response as a member of the Education Committee as well. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next up, Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of the witnesses for being here. I know it's going to be a surprise to my colleagues on this committee, but I want to talk about forestry. And the reason I want to talk about forestry is because Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the nation. Georgia has over 22 million acres of commercially available private timberland, more than any other state. And each of those acres serves as a carbon sink. You see here, trees are the answer. Trees are the answers because forests serve as carbon sinks. They serve as a water filter, as an air filter, as well as a habitat for wildlife. In fact, Mr. Loris, in your testimony, you said that fully restoring understocked productive forest land in the U.S. could increase carbon sequestration by 20%. By 20%. Bruce Westerman, the Representative Westerman, the ranking member on natural resources, has a bill called the Tree and Trees Act. We're trying to make sure that we plant 1 trillion trees. It's a great bill, great effort. And one of the problems that we're facing is ensuring that forests remain forests, because landowners can use their land for just about anything to make a living, and they do. But unfortunately, due to natural disasters, hurricanes, fires, a lot of times after they have this natural disaster, they don't put it back into forest land. And that's what we need to encourage them to do. So I've got legislation that is co-sponsored by Representative Sewell from Alabama. It's called the Disaster Reforestation Act. And this will help fix a portion of the tax code that makes it difficult for forest landowners to continue using their land for forest. I want to ask you, Mr. Loris, what are some other barriers to expanding and maintaining our forests, both public and private forest lands?
I think the two challenges are we need to protect the ones we've got, and there are a number of policy fixes that I think could help with timber harvesting, removing export bans on timber harvesting that occurs on federal lands, expanding acreage limits for categorical exclusions for controlled or prescribed burns, excluding state level air quality emission standards for prescribed burns as well, which would just be a temporary fix, but to allow a prescribed burn to happen on a good day where it's not windy is a temporary fix to ensuring that we don't have worse environmental and climate outcomes as a result of a more intense natural disaster in a wildfire. And then, I think to your other point is planting more. There's a number of provisions within the Trillion Trees Act, matching grant programs to provide seeds and saplings for states, for nonprofits, for tribes to continue to plant more trees. And I think the more we could also expand afforestation efforts as part of remediation of abandoned mine sites. Excuse me. There's thousands of mine sites that need environmental remediation, and the more we could inject natural climate solutions into that remediation, and there's some good legislation that will remove some of the environmental liability risk associated with environmental mine land cleanup, the better off we're going to be.
Good. Well, thank you. Well, one thing I know that we can do is expand the use of wood and the wood products as a renewable resource. And that would both ensure that there's always a market for working forests, keeping them economically viable, and that we continue to grow trees that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Mr. Loris, can you speak very quickly to the environmental benefits of using wood and forest products and how we could further incentivize this, specifically about the life cycle of emissions? This is one thing that I think we miss the point. When people talk about biomass, they think, oh, you're burning something, therefore it's putting carbon in the atmosphere. No way it can be it can be environmentally friendly. But if you look at the whole life cycle, it indeed is. Mr. Loris?
Yeah, that's right. And I think we can expand the use of wood projects to continue to utilize wood as a safe, environmentally sustainable product. And again, that's where I think some of the legislative opportunities to enhance the availability of wood projects, whether that's through ARC legislation that would enhance opportunities for these kind of new, more efficient types of wood, and even, harvesting younger trees is still going to be better off from an environmental standpoint. And if you look at what the alternative might be in terms of using cement or other products that are more emissions intense, you're still going to be better off from an environmental and climate standpoint. So not only does it provide economic opportunities, but it provides environmental benefits.
Okay, well, good. Again, trees are the answer. Remember what they say back home, Madam Chair. When you breathe fresh air, get down on your knees and thank the farmer who planted the trees. God bless America, and I yield back.
Mr. Carter, you're giving me visions of the Lorax and Needs and truffula trees and the Onceler. And I know that, what did they say? Unless someone cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So let's all take that to heart today. And now we'll go to Rep. Levin.
I'm not sure
For
if I
5
can
minutes.
follow my friend Buddy Carter, but thank you, Chair Castor. As a representative for California, I want to highlight how natural solutions can and must play a key role in addressing some of the pressing environmental challenges, particularly those facing California. First, let me start off with natural solutions to address wildfire risk. Over the last 4 years, California communities have suffered from 7 of the largest fires in state history. Again, that's just over the last 4 years. These fires have collectively burned over 2.5 million acres and destroyed or damaged over 30,000 structures. And with climate change, we know that we can't just prepare for a fire season, but must now deal with this threat year-round. And we know that wildfire risk will likely only continue to increase, with the UN Environment Program recently finding that the likelihood of extreme wildfires is expected to increase by up to 14% by 2030 and up to 50% by 2100 as a result of climate change and changes in land use. Mr. O'Mara, thanks for your testimony. You highlighted how natural solutions can minimize the impacts and severity of wildfires, and you noted how, due to ever increasing wildfire risk, federal land management agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service have had to spend significantly larger portions of their budgets on fire suppression, limiting their ability to fund restoration and management activities to improve ecosystem health and resilience. This hearing, I hope, is making it abundantly clear that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Mr. O'Mara, can you share why the significant investments in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, specifically for wildfire risk reduction, are so important in reducing long-term wildfire risk?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, and thanks for your incredible leadership on this difficult issue. As you said, I mean, healthy forests, having, making sure that you have ecologically appropriate reforestation practices, making sure you're removing invasives, making sure you're trying to get at things like disease, or trying to make sure that you have, moving, in some cases, small diameter trees and some of the tinder that, leads to these massive fires, is all part of having systems that are much more resilient to the kind of fire spread that we've seen. I think a lot of folks talk about the acreage of the fires. It's the intensity too. It's the level of heat. There's not enough soil moisture in some of these cases. So all of a sudden, fires that may have had a couple, tens of thousands of acres all of a sudden are in hundreds of thousands of acres or millions of acres because these systems are not sufficiently resourced. And like for most of the last decade, the Forest Service was spending more than 60% of the budget fighting fires, not actually restoring forests. The bipartisan infrastructure package is going to help reverse that. The $27 billion that's proposed in the reconciliation package would very much fix that. So hopefully that can be part of the ongoing negotiations.
Exactly. Well, you pointed out that $27.5 billion for forest restoration that was included in the House passed reconciliation bill. That would be transformational for the West. And I think we'll all continue to fight for a strong reconciliation package and specifically for that funding. Shifting gears, I wanted to speak about another challenge we're facing in Southern California, and that's water scarcity. We know that droughts, wildfires, rising temperatures, and the degradation of natural ecosystems are exacerbating this water crisis that we're facing. Can you expand on how protecting natural ecosystems on a watershed-wide scale can protect access to reliable, clean water, and also how restoration projects in upper watersheds benefit users downstream?
Yeah, I mean, having healthy ecosystems, whether that's healthy forests or healthy grasslands, do provide an absorption value to keep kind of water where you need it and not having the high rates of evaporation that we're seeing in Southern California, for example. Some of the challenges we're facing in the Sacramento Delta up north, and really kind of making sure you're kind of holding the water where you need it, so you have the access to it, as the demand in the right places. And so again, I mean, folks don't always think about forests as a not just a carbon sink, but a kind of a water sink as a way to have these healthy watersheds. But it is a critical part of the solution, and I'd much rather see that than some of the man-made conveyances that aren't nearly as effective as what Mother Nature created.
Thank you for that. Dr. Eisenberg, I'd like to turn to you. Staying on the topic of water, I was excited to hear about your work with tribal communities in Montana, restoring degraded lands with native plants, and was glad to hear about the positive ecosystem health benefits you've seen through these restoration partnerships with tribal communities. Can you discuss how these restoration practices can improve water resilience on an ecosystem-wide scale? And also, how can restoring grasslands be a key natural solution to the West's water scarcity challenges?
Well, this has to do with fire and soil. So fire is part of traditional practices done by Native people in forests and grasslands throughout the United States for millennia. And what this does is it puts more carbon into the soil and in the prairie rangelands. And what that does is it greatly increases, has the potential to greatly increase the capacity of the soils to store water. Prairie soils, there's roots that go down up to 3 meters from these prairie grasses. And so the combination, Native people used fire to create the sort of resiliency that you have been expressing concern about, and to help retain moisture in both forest and grassland ecosystems. So fire is a critical piece of it. And so the restoration programs that we're working on right now, we have a proposal to the BLM for a large program in Oregon, in the forests of Oregon, in the dry forest, to look at these things. So it's not just about grasslands. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg. I'm out of time, but I look forward to working with you and all of our witnesses and hopefully across the aisle on this very important issue. And I'll yield back.
Rep. Levin, next up is Rep. Crenshaw. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the ranking member for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I absolutely think the work of conservation efforts and forest management and protection of our natural resources is extremely important. And I'm sure the work done by many of our witnesses has contributed positively to that effort. I do have some concerns, as you might imagine. I have concerns that many environmental groups do not understand that critical balance between energy development and environmentalism. I fear that many do not understand that you can indeed do both. After all, it was natural gas fracking in America that led to historic reductions in CO2 emissions. And I don't think this is a goal of many environmental groups, unintentionally, intentionally, whatever it may be. There's been a serious undermining of American energy development in the United States, which has geopolitical implications, as we're seeing now with Russia and Ukraine and Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas. So my questions are going to be for Mr. O'Mara. You stated in your 990 that you're currently supporting litigation against Enbridge Line 5, which, if successful, would remove 500,000 barrels per day, causing yet another serious supply shortage of petroleum products in an environment where there's already extreme shortages, increasing gas prices in an environment where gas prices are already very high. Are you using federal grant money to do this for your efforts, recognizing given the context that that money is indeed fungible?
No. So we receive very little federal money.
Okay, but money is fungible. So you're taking grant money, and just a quick count of federal grant money from the last few 990s is over $4 million,
For projects on the ground.
but it's fungible.
It's not.
So outside of grant money from the United States government, what other sources fund your organization?
So we have 6 million members. So folks that are sending $15. We have Ranger Rick magazine, which folks subscribe to. We have some foundations that support us.
What about Sea Change Foundation? How much have you received from Sea Change?
Nothing in years.
I have the numbers in front of me. In the past, your organization has received $3.4 million in funding from Sea Change.
Nothing in the last 6 years, though. I've only been CEO for the last 5 or 6 years. I think that was before.
Okay, so it was before, so it has happened in the past. It's good to know. The reason I'm concerned about this is because it's well documented that Sea Change is in part funded by a Russian shell company based in Bermuda called Klein Limited. Vladimir Putin funnels money through Klein to organizations for obvious reasons, to undermine American oil and gas and keep the world dependent on Russian oil and gas. And I'll submit these reports for the record. But you were never aware of this or aware
No,
of these
and
accusations?
Congressman, I mean, I think if you talk to some of your colleagues, we're considered like one of the most moderate, pragmatic organizations, actually trying to find solutions for domestic production and conservation at the same time. So I'm a little surprised by this line of questioning, frankly.
Well, it's because these talking points that Russia puts out and that some of our environmental groups put out that are anti-American energy, they tend to coincide. They tend to be the same. And it's concerning when you start to follow the money. I appreciate the fact that it hasn't happened in 6 years. That's good news, but the talking points haven't changed and the efforts haven't changed. You know, and here's another question. So if you get rid of this pipeline, you get rid of more American production, do you think that affects worldwide demand or worldwide emissions?
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about Line 5 specifically, it's coming from Canada. It's going across the Great Lakes. It's a 63-year-old pipe that's under both Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. If it ruptures, it'll be a catastrophic impact that's greater. It's going to make the BP oil spill look like child's play. I do think that's different. I mean, there are other pipeline projects we have not opposed. I mean, we are not in kind of the pipeline business generally. If the Great Lakes become contaminated, especially when there's other alternatives, there's a Sarna line, there's the 17th line, there's a bunch of other options in that region. Like having the Great Lakes be contaminated on our watch will be one of the greatest environmental disasters in our history. We're not in the middle of all these other pipeline fights that you hear from other different groups, but that's one where it's the most important freshwater source of water in the world. And having that happen, and frankly, Enbridge, given their history of the Kalamazoo spill and others, I mean, it's just one of those cases where we need a better solution because you have a pipe that was supposed to last for 50 years and we're at 60 something and counting.
Okay. Look, and the reason I'm concerned about this, I'm not the only one who's ever brought this up, that Russian propaganda has made its way into a lot of environmentalist talking points. You've done a good job defending your organization today, and I appreciate that. But I'm not the only one who said this. Hillary Clinton has stated this is true. NATO Secretary General has stated this is true. Our ODNI has stated this is true. Our National Security Council members have come out and testified again for this. So it's an important piece of the puzzle when we talk about American production and how to balance that with environmentalism. You know, believe it or not, we're all on the same page on a lot of these efforts to increase our conservation efforts and protect the environment. But we also have to protect people's ability to make a life for themselves and bring themselves out of poverty. And you can only do that through energy security and in an environment where inflation isn't skyrocketing. And so some of these efforts directly contribute to that and benefit Russia. And I think that's the broader point.
Well, and Congressman, to that point, I mean, look, I would much rather have clean American energy displacing Russian oil and gas. I'd much rather have, clean supplies. Let's make sure it's as clean as possible. Let's make sure the rhetoric is real.
Glad to hear that.
Let's use American energy and clean energy. Heat pumps, renewable energy, but let's export all of our technologies to fight democracy.
Fully agree. 41% higher emissions if you use Russian gas over American gas. So thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Next, we'll go to Rep. Brownlee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing. I thank the witnesses today. I can't help but to take the opportunity to brag about a project in the district that I will soon represent after the 2022 election. It's a project in a little town called Agoura Hills, between the Simi Hills and the Santa Monica Mountains. And on Earth Day of this month, April 22nd, there will be a groundbreaking groundbreaking in terms of building a bridge over the 101 freeway. It is a bridge that is billed as the world's largest wildlife crossing. It's a bridge that will be the first of its kind near a major metropolitan area. And as I mentioned, the largest in the world, stretching over 10 highway lanes on a very, 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 very busy freeway. So, Mr. O'Mara, I know that this is that the National Wildlife Federation has been involved in this project. It is a very, very exciting thing that's happening in my area of the Conejo Valley, the Santa Monica Mountains, the Simi Hills. The partnership on this project is really inspiring. I think it's extraordinary. It's a partnership with the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, the California Department of Transportation, as we call it, Caltrans in California, the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, the National Park Service, and the National Wildlife Federation. So, Mr. O'Mara, I just wanted you to comment on this project. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the benefits of this project. And if you could talk a little bit about, how this whole public-private partnership came to be.
Thank you so much for the question, and we're looking forward to seeing you on Earth Day. It's going to be a great event out there in just a few weeks. So this is a great project. It would be the largest wildlife crossing in the world. The mountain lion population of Southern California across the Agora Hills and this into the San Gabriel's, kind of thinking about like the 101 and 5, it's been completely bisected by massive highways. And so this is a project to try to reconnect some of that habitat in a very smart ecological way. It was started by some amazing research by the National Park Service that was looking at fatalities of these amazing mountain lions that were dying as they were trying to get across the 101 as a way to find mates and find food. And so Beth Pratt, who I'm sure you know, Congresswoman, has been a dynamo on this project, pulling together all the partners, amazing leaders like philanthropists like Wallace Allenberg and the governor, as well as so many other partners that you mentioned. But this is a project, and I think if we can show that we can go across a 10-lane highway in California, we should be able to have wildlife crossings and connectivity all across the country. And we were grateful for your leadership and others on this committee for making that crossings program part of the infrastructure package. There's about $50 million a year to do these kind of projects. And the interesting thing too is that the insurance companies love it because one of the biggest sources of payouts are wildlife collisions. And so it's a way to actually reduce vehicle accidents and make roads a little safer and help wildlife at the same time.
Thank you so much for that. And just with another minute or so left, in your testimony, you talked about nature solutions only being about 5%, of climate spending altogether. So, that sort of makes me, I think this might go back to somewhat of what the chair of the committee was asking originally in her questions. But if it's only 5% of the climate spending, are we really, and this, I think this hearing is really about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure. The benefits are so great. Are we really prioritizing correctly, I guess is the question, in terms of how we are spending dollars to mitigate climate?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And I mean, of course, I want to see more investment on the natural climate solutions. I think it is, bipartisan. I think it's incredibly smart, both for resilience and for carbon abatement. And at the same time, we also need the technological solutions. And so I don't want to position it as an either or. I think we have been a little light on that side, but as we're electrifying the grid and thinking about transportation and all the other investments on the climate side, I just want to make sure that something that could be a quarter of the solution isn't left so far behind, especially when it can be so bipartisan in this current environment.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Next up, Rep. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to go back to a question that my colleague, Mr. Crenshaw, asked about your funding. You did receive $2.1 million from the MacArthur Foundation between 1991 and 2021, when you sent, that would fall into the time frame for climate solutions and environmental work. Is that correct?
The MacArthur Foundation?
Yes.
Yes, I think we received maybe $500,000 last year.
How about the Hewlett?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Loris, there was a report from the Little Hoover Commission entitled Fire on the Mountain, Rethinking Forest Management in Sierra Nevada. That was the topic of a San Francisco Chronicle article, and the lead of the article said a century of mismanaging Sierra Nevada forests has brought an unprecedented environmental catastrophe that impacts all Californians. The commission goes on to say plans for prescribed burning to rid the forest of dense ground cover often clash with regional air quality regulations, even as emissions from catastrophic wildfires nullify hard-fought carbon reduction accomplishments. I just want to know your opinion in regard to the misguided ideas about prescribed burns, which have led to unhealthy forests, more carbon emissions, and unnecessary wildfire damage and deaths, and particularly the intense heat that is created by wildfires because of the failure to properly manage the forest. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, and Colin was exactly right when he said, it's not just about the size of these wildfires, it's also about the intensity and the heat. And, prescribed burns and controlled burns is something that the U.S. has been doing for a long time. And unfortunately, in places where there's been more bureaucratic hurdles, it's been happening less frequently than it otherwise should. I mean, you could look at a place like Florida juxtaposed to California, and the rate of controlled burns in a place like Florida is so much more efficient than what happens in California. And so I think this is something that has been, time and proven again, where forest managers at the federal level, at state level, nonprofits, private organizations, private landowners all understand the environmental importance of controlled burns. And when a overly bureaucratic environmental review process happens, when these projects are held up in years of litigation, we see what happens.
Okay. I also have an article from Mother Jones News. It's a favorite publication of leftists, and it's about the pine beetles that are ravaging western forest. It's been an issue in southern forest for decades, for years, as long as I can remember. And in the article, I'll read what it says. They're often described as pesky invaders. Bark beetles have been a key part of conifer ecosystems for ages, ensuring that the groves don't get overcrowded. Is this a leftist? I don't even know how to describe this. Is this some idea of how to log forests through beetles to manage forest? I mean, to allow pine beetles to continue to decimate these forests and actually create even more fuel for forest fires?
Not to my knowledge. And again, preventing and eradicating invasive species should be a bipartisan issue. And I think there's a lot of pragmatic groups who believe that to be so. And the infrastructure bill provides $100 billion each to the Department of Agriculture and Department of Interior. Again, I think the more we can get people on the ground doing the work to eradicate the invasive species, and the more we can provide and harness collaborative relationships between private landowners, federal and state agencies, and the federal agency, the better off we're going to be.
Hey, let me move on to that. One of the ways to prevent this destruction of the forest is to log these forests. And that's a way of sequestering carbon. When you cut the timber and you turn it into wood products, you sequester carbon. But that's also a way to mitigate the infestation of the pine beetles. You can cut the infested trees, peel off the bark and burn them, which that creates some emissions issues, or cut the trees and then spray with toxic sprays. Doesn't it make more sense to engage in sensible logging practices and forest management than to allow the pine beetles to continue to destroy the forest and again, create this massive amount of deadwood fuel that create these intensely hot fires?
Yeah, and part of that speaks to permitting and again, environmental review challenges. I don't mean to sound like a broken record. You could lift the export ban on unprocessed timber on federal lands. I mentioned the ARC legislation, the America's Revegetation and Carbon Sequestration Act, that would allow for some of this development to occur. And again, for more mass timber development. And again, I think we need to look at the trade-offs when you use more timber, when you promote healthier forests, rather than using concrete and rather than losing these forests to extremely intense and large wildfires, the better off we're going to be from an economic standpoint, but also from a pollution and a greenhouse gas emission standpoint.
My time has expired. I yield back.
Next up, Rep. Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to talk about natural solutions as the theme of this, but I do just want to start. I feel compelled to respond to some of the comments that have been made. Tomorrow will be the 2-year anniversary of President Trump calling the Saudi Arabian government and saying that we were going to withhold, we are going to take our troops out unless you cut OPEC production. And in his words, because of a strong desire to protect the U.S. oil industry. I am delighted that in the 2 years since, my colleagues across the aisle are now opposed to Vladimir Putin. I'm delighted that my colleagues across the aisle now support providing defensive weapons to Ukraine. That is a genuine transition. It is welcome, overdue, and I think it's genuine. I'm also extremely disappointed that they continue to oppose every policy that would reduce fossil fuel demand while simultaneously opposing anything that would increase fossil fuel supply, as the ranking member did today in his opening statement. You cannot oppose demand reduction and oppose supply reduction and claim to be in support of lowering fossil fuel costs. I get that that provides a lot of money to the fossil fuel industry. I get the fossil fuel industry would like to charge more for their product. Please do not represent that ever again as being in the interest of consumers. I'm sure you'll have some responses. Let me now move to, I want to thank Mr. Carter for his comments on trees. And I think that the benefits of trees sequestering carbon are welcome. Urban trees are a really interesting thing. In the Morton Arboretum that does some fascinating work in Chicago, showing that urban areas with trees, because of evapotranspiration, because of shade, are 5 to 10 degrees cooler, less load on the air conditioning. Was my pleasure to provide them with $750,000 to help further their research, because these trees are actually increasingly unable to survive in urban environments because of warming and pollution. And Mr. O'Meara, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what we can do federally to enhance our urban tree canopy and help the viability of those forests.
No, thanks so much. And thanks for your leadership on this. I think it's a huge opportunity, and it's not just the urban heat island effect, it's also the health benefits. I mean, folks that have healthy tree canopies have lower rates of asthma. You see less other respiratory illnesses. I mean, the public health benefits are massive. Some of the best work in the country is actually being done in Louisville, Kentucky, where they're actually doing a lot of work. It's been fairly segregated. The wealthier areas had a lot of trees, other areas didn't. And looking at like the benefits on the policy side, I think making sure that like urban tree canopy are just in eligible use for a lot of these programs. A lot of times they're an afterthought because we think of private lands or state lands or federal lands. I think there is a issue with like technical assistance, making sure there's enough capacity to actually do the care and feeding and making sure the trees survive. Because as you said, warmer temperatures are leading to higher death rates of trees in different communities. But I think there's big opportunities through some existing pots, as well as some things we could kind of tuck into other authorizations.
I'd love to work on that. Moving from the urban to the much broader. I've seen estimates that getting back to the soil carbon contents that we had 100 years ago, I've seen as much as 30 to 80 parts per million that we could pull out of the atmosphere if we could bring that back. Now, some of that's easier said than done, but there's a really interesting program that Illinois has rolled out to enhance the use of cover crops and couple that to reductions in crop insurance for farmers, to sort of use currency that the farmer understands, but add cover crops that not only increase soil carbon retention, but increase topsoil retention, a whole host of other, you'd see you nodding your heads. We're working on trying to find ways to sort of federalize that really good state policy. And I'm wondering if you have any comments on what we might factor in as we think about maximizing the use of cover crops, not just in terms of the climate benefits, but also doing it in ways that will resonate with the farmers who are going to deploy this and address any concerns that they might have.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We're seeing the uptick of cover crops going up in many parts of the country right now. And Illinois is a great example of some good work in Wisconsin as well. It's not for climate reasons. I mean, it's because it reduces soil erosion and improves productivity because the soils are richer and they're more fertile. It also is a way to reduce, kind of flooding impacts and just make sure that topsoil isn't kind of blowing off. And so, I also think that we should be compensating farmers for some of the carbon benefits as well, if they're willing to do it. And so, I mean, I would love to be in a world where farmers are paid for the commodity, but also for some of the other benefits they're providing. And the incentive of crop insurance is a perfect one. Or all of a sudden, we know we're going to have to pay out less if the soils are healthier and there's less erosion. You're going to have less damage from the next catastrophic storm. So I think getting those incentives right, but not making it a climate program. It's just like there's a climate co-benefit, which is great, but let's do it because it improves the economics, improves the soil health.
Okay, and I know we're about out of time, but if you have further comments for the record, one of the things that we've been struggling with is different regions of the country, depending on the planting season and when the cover crop goes in, farmers think about it in different ways, and trying to find a way to do this, not with a one size fits all, but something that works for the different types of agricultural environments in the country.
And there's some great thinking going on right now at the University of Illinois, Champaign, around making sure that some of the cover crops have markets and not thinking of them just as like a byproduct, but actually having them as another economic driver. So yeah, we'd love to work with you on that.
Thanks so much. Yield back.
Next up, Ranking Member Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's not often that I have a chance to speak after Mr. Caston. So I'm gonna go ahead and enjoy this for just a minute. Look, we can sit here all day long, and I'd be happy to stay here as long as you want and go through all the facts. Facts is that under the Biden administration, we saw a 161% increase in dependence upon Russian crude oil. Number one, period. That's a fact. Number two, you and your colleagues not only have opposed domestic energy production, just as this administration is doing, and I'm going to quote this president when he said, we are going to ban all oil and gas. I'm going to quote this Interior Secretary when I say that she said, we are going to ban drilling on public lands and fracking everywhere. I'm going to talk about the SEC ESG initiatives. I'm going to talk about the executive order that said we're not going to do any new production on federal lands. I mean, look, what we're and then talk about how we're going to go out there and we're going to use renewables, but then stop the Twin Metals mine and other efforts to actually produce critical minerals in the United States that are required for renewable energy. Your energy policy is none of the above, not all of the above. Every single thing that we're experiencing right now is a result of the failed or just say the lack of an energy strategy by this administration. And I hate to say this, Mr. Caston, but you and your colleagues have been complicit in this. We've offered amendments. I've offered amendments over and over again to ban Russian oil, to prohibit it. And you know who's voted against it? That side of the aisle. Y'all want to have this discussion? I'll have this discussion all day long. Let me say it again. The president yesterday said 1 million barrels of oil, 1 million barrels of oil a day. You know how much he was importing from Russia? 200,000 barrels. That's 5 times the amount. 5 times the amount every single day. You know why? Because it's mitigating for stupid energy strategies. I am all for all of the above. I'll sit down with any of y'all and talk through it. No policy and objecting to everything is not a strategy. And the American people that we all represent are paying for it right now. And it's ridiculous. I want to thank y'all for being here. I want to say, Mr. O'Mara, I got to tell you, I've worked with him for a while when he was in Delaware, and I've found him to be an honest man, and I found him to be a good partner to work with. Although I do want to say, to protect your reputation, we don't always agree. Mr. O'Mara, I want to make sure I understand something that you said, and you just give me a yes or no. You said in your extensive testimony, a lot of things, but one of them is that you believe that sequestration is a part of our should be a part of a net zero strategy. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And you advocate for natural solutions such as trees and other natural uptake. Something I think you and I have worked on in the past is engineered oyster reefs, living shorelines and things like that as a way to kind of get your win-win scenarios. That's
Absolutely
accurate. Okay. So 45Q, which is enacted, is that an okay policy?
Absolutely.
But we need to make
Let's make it inclusive. Let's include,
right. So you believe that 45Q is good, but that we should expand its scope to include natural or biogenic sources.
Exactly.
Okay, which
it's cheaper.
I
It's a lot
totally
cheaper.
agree with you. Totally on board. And I think that does make sense. And then lastly, in regard to efforts to restore coastal ecosystems or wetlands or help to prevent the loss of those, you agree that both of those are strategies to either sequester or to prevent the release of greenhouse gases.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Mr. Loris, Ezra Klein did an op-ed in the New York Times a while back, and he was talking about how NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, while well-intentioned perhaps, over the years and much case law that has, in my opinion, very much deviated from the actual focus or purpose of NEPA, that it has actually contributed to the impediments, I guess, in terms of our efforts to try to carry out projects such as renewable energy projects. You care to respond or comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're seeing a movement from a lot of folks kind of on the center left aisle who are recognizing that some of the biggest impediments to clean energy infrastructure, to natural climate solutions, is onerous and bureaucratic environmental reviews and litigious organizations who prevent these projects from happening in a timely manner. Ezra Klein did it. Matt Iglesias, another center-left economist, talked about the importance of cost reduction, but also of deployment. And you can't deploy technologies, you can't deploy transmission lines, you can't deploy new nuclear power plants, you can't deploy natural climate solutions without efficient environmental reviews and permitting. And so I think, if you're talking about a silver bullet, this is certainly not it. There's a lot of things we need to do for American leadership and for global decarbonization. But in terms of helping with all of these solutions to decarbonize the energy sector, the manufacturing sector, and the agriculture and environmental sector for more carbon uptake, this is something that can really accomplish all of those things.
Thank you, Mr. Loris. I'm out of time, but Madam Chair, I just want one line. There's a quote from a 2016 private speech that Hillary Clinton gave that says, quote, "We were even up against phony environmental groups, and I'm a big environmentalist, but these were funded by the Russians." Yield back.
Okay. Next up, we'll go to Representative Huffman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thought we started off on a fairly hopeful note in terms of finding one of those rare issues in the climate conversation where we could have common ground and try to solve problems. And unfortunately, some of the recent comments have taken us pretty deep down the rabbit hole. A few moments ago, I actually thought we were going to hear that Bill Gates was implanting microchips into pine beetles. And then more recently, we hear this preposterous narrative that major national environmental groups are somehow under the influence of Vladimir Putin, as if he wants clean energy. The one thing that would render him powerless and irrelevant on the world stage. Look, the truth is there's a glass house problem when our colleagues across the aisle start suggesting that environmental groups are parroting Putin talking points. It is the fossil fuel industry that for decades has had a very lucrative bromance with Vladimir Putin. It was the Trump administration for 4 years that had the greatest collection of Putin fanboys outside of the Kremlin anyone's ever seen. And our colleagues thought that was just wonderful. It was making America great again. Look, we should not be looking to the fossil fuel industry that's been writing their talking points on these subjects as for solutions to this mess. We should be sending them the bill for the war in Ukraine, because the fossil fuel industry has always been interested and today is still interested in only one thing, and that is keeping as many people as possible hooked on their fossil fuel so that they can keep making lots and lots of money. It's not very complicated, and maybe I should put it in terms that my colleagues could understand in light of last week's revelations. If you've got a colleague that is doing key bumps of cocaine, whatever that is, and you tell them, gee, that's really bad for you, that's hurting you. Let me hook you up with this other dealer who's got better stuff. That's not a very good answer to the problem. And replacing dirty Putin natural gas with more dirty natural gas is not an answer to the energy crisis, the climate crisis, or the fact that we continue to experience fossil fuel driven wars. So let's just get real about all of this stuff. And let's try to bring the conversation back to things that were actually agendized, where we might be able to find some solutions together. Mr. Amara, restoring and better managing our U.S. lands and waters can mitigate 1/5 of our carbon emissions. We can create hundreds of thousands of jobs. That's something we ought to be interested in talking about. Can you talk a little more about how natural solutions not only protect communities, and I represent a coastal community like Mr. Graves, but also increase the resiliency of ecosystems in the face of our climate crisis.
No, and thank you for your all the work that you've done. I think we're seeing both obviously huge sequestration benefits, but the ecological resilience of these systems is just increasingly important. We're seeing whether it's from a wildlife perspective, given the stressors that we're seeing on a whole range of species, for communities that are adjacent, whether that's coastal communities suffering from some kind of coastal storm or a fire, that these healthy systems that basically every dollar we've spent, and whether it's in your district or out east in restoring these systems returns about $6 to $8 of avoided damage. And the places where we've invested have been able to come through these kind of horrific events much more whole than other communities that haven't had those same benefits. And so I think it really is just that win-win-win where it's safer, healthier, and better for the economy.
Terrific. And then we haven't heard from Mr. Westerman yet, but he does have a bill with a wonderful title, Trillion Trees Act. If good titles made a great bill, we'd be off to the races with that legislation. And he and I have had lots of conversations about this, but the science is pretty clear that not all forests are alike. Not all treatments are the same in terms of their carbon sequestration capacity. Could you talk about the importance of protecting old growth trees? I don't know about Georgia and Mr. Carter's trees, but I know that on the West Coast and in lots of places in California, we have trees that can keep growing up to 800 years. And I think the science is fairly clear that it is that old growth phenomenon that most powerfully sequesters carbon. So we've got to protect those things while we talk about other types of forest management strategies. Please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, some of the amazing sequoias and redwoods are spectacular. And, from a carbon, point of view, I think, one of the cases we try to make is that if we were actually compensating, whether it's landowners or others, for the carbon value, all of a sudden you change the incentives around, cutting earlier or like having these different economic drivers. Because I really don't want, forest owners growing houses either, right? I want them to stay in forests. But I do think some of the economic incentives, especially given some of the trade policy issues the last several years, have been pushing folks to cut earlier. And so we're not getting the carbon benefits. We're also not getting like the long-term benefits like you're talking about. And so the question is, how do you realign those incentives? That's why I think that 45Q idea is kind of interesting, because all of a sudden, like, if I know I'm going to make more by allowing it to grow longer, because all of a sudden that those incentives start aligning and you can have robust markets at the same time.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Next up, Rep. Escobar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and many thanks to our panelists as well. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. Frequently when we talk about protecting ecological treasures, we talk about the oceans, we talk about forests, we rarely talk about the desert. I represent El Paso, Texas, a vibrant and safe, wonderful community on the US-Mexico border that is in the Chihuahuan Desert. And in my community, in the middle of it is the Franklin Mountains. And at the base of the Franklin Mountains is this incredible treasure known as Kasner Range. Kasner Range is about 7,000 acres that belongs to the federal government. And for generations, for at least 50 years, El Pasoans have been trying to preserve Kasner Range and try to convince the federal government to preserve it for open space purposes. I have filed legislation to designate Kasner Range a national monument in the hopes that it can at some point be utilized for trails and for educational opportunities for young people, because there were many ancestors who came before us who lived on that land, lots of archaeological treasure, and also lots of endangered species. The challenge for us is that it was an artillery range. And so there's unexploded ordnance on the property. And so, we've been trying to collaborate with the federal government about how to approach it. But in the meantime, the area around Kasner, or at the foot of it on the other side of our freeway, there's been lots of development. We know that there's always especially in urban areas, a desire to have the best view and to build as you know, as much as possible on the side of the mountain. And El Paso is no different. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of that happen. But one of the things that I'd actually like to ask you, Mr. O'Mara and Dr. Eisenberg, about, we were talking about damage done to our ecological treasures. Kastner Range is also home to lots of arroyos. And for folks who don't know what an arroyo is, it's a water channel, basically. And even though El Paso is in the Chihuahuan Desert, and we unfortunately have dealt with long-term drought, we also have monsoon seasons. And we have now seen 100-year flooding. We've seen unprecedented damage done to property and people, literally hundreds of millions of damage. And with the ongoing drought, the soil just is not ready or equipped for rapid and large amounts of rainfall. So if both of you could speak to helping me get the federal government to understand preserving open space in a desert where there's drought and flooding, that it protects people and property. Can you speak to the importance of that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Congresswoman, and thanks for your work on that. And it was great to see the secretary there the other day. I think there's a huge opportunity, and there's this assumption that because it's a desert environment, that's not a living environment. And there are challenges with invasive species. There are challenges with restoring native vegetation. There's issues in some cases in part of that range with like salt cedar and turmeric and some of the other invasive species that suck up so much water. There's enough for kind of the native vegetation. And I think the conservation of the area is kind of the starting point. But like what we'd like to work on with yourself and others in the valley, kind of more broadly, is that the restoration of these assets. I mean, I think when you look at the water levels in the Rio Grande in particular, a little further south, the challenges that we have with not having enough water, the river running dry, is because we're actually absorbing billions of dollars, 25 billion gallons of water between the salt cedar and there's a huge restoration opportunity there. It doesn't get the same kind of attention because folks don't think of it the same way, but I'd love to work on it with you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Eisenberg, in the final 40 seconds of my time, would you like to add anything?
Yes, ecocultural restoration is critically important here, and restoration practices that takes into consideration the practices of the ancestors. And actually, that is the part of North America that my ancestors are from, northern Mexico. And so tapping into tribal wisdom about this is essential, and restoring those practices which addresses invasive species, reintroducing fire if it was used regionally, which it probably was, and that then enables the soil to retain more moisture. Fire was used throughout the Southwest by Native
Dr.
peoples.
I'm sorry, we have a vote and we have another member. Thank you, Rep. Escobar. And next we'll go to Mr. Westerman. Thank you for your interest in the Climate Crisis Committee. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me to join today. I'm a lot to cover here, so I'm going to just jump right into it. I was pleased when I read the majority's memo on the hearing, and especially the part where they reference climate and ecological data. And just to be brief, I want to make sure that our witnesses are on the same page. As I read these bullet points, if you disagree with it, please raise your hand. If not, we'll just go to the next one. The first point says a 2020 report published in the Journal of Nature found that if 15% of identified priority areas are restored, 60% of expected extinctions could be avoided, and around 465 billion tons of CO2 could be sequestered, equal to 30% of the total amount of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. Anybody disagree? A 2019 report published in the journal Environmental Science and Technology found that restoring tree canopy cover can lead to a 27% further reduction in air pollution. Anybody disagree? A 2021 study in environmental research letters found that forests provide the highest quality water supplies among all land uses, and that the more than 150 million Americans depend on forested lands for their drinking water. Anybody disagree? A 2021 study published in the journals Frontier and Plant Science found that the restoration of degraded grasslands from severe to moderate degradation stage improved grassland vegetation by more than 38% and soil water storage by almost 42%. Anybody disagree? A 2021 study published in the journal Science found that 20 years after replanting tropical forests, numerous measures, including soil fertility, carbon storage, and tree diversity, returned to nearly 80% of levels of old growth forests. Finally, a 2019 study published in the journal Science found that adding 2.2 billion acres of trees, tree cover would capture 205 billion metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere, which is equivalent to nearly 2/3 of the carbon emitted since the Industrial Revolution. Anybody disagree? I've read most of the reports that are behind these statements, and I agree. And that last one is actually the basis for the Trillion Trees Initiative, the Global Trillion Trees Initiative. Madam Chair, for the record, I would also like to submit this paper called Decarbonizing U.S. Buildings by the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And it has a statement: residential and commercial buildings account for roughly 29% of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Anybody disagree? Here's another one. It's a published journal article, Mass Timber, Global Warming, Carbon, in CLT. It's talking about using buildings to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it says the building sector is a major source of global greenhouse gas emissions. Construction-related CO2 emissions equal 5.7 billion tons, accounting for 23% of the emissions resulting from global economic activities. It goes on to say the building sector takes on even greater significance when considering the approaching wave of 2.3 billion new urban residents. And it says buildings, energy-related CO2 emissions from buildings is 39% globally. Anybody disagree? Next, do you support planting trees at home and abroad and using natural regeneration methods to increase forest cover so that we can grow more wood to store more carbon? Anybody disagree? Do you support management activities to make our existing forests more resilient and healthy to grow more wood and store more carbon? Nobody disagrees. Do you support sustainable building practices to reduce carbon emissions during manufacturing and transporting building materials, reducing carbon emissions from building operations and increasing the amount of carbon stored in the built structure? Everybody support that? Do you support using low-grade woody biomass material from our forests to make renewable biofuel and biochar that can be used as a soil additive for grasslands and agriculture that increases soil water efficiency and would be a long-term carbon storage solution? Everybody supports that. Madam Chair, it appears that there's unanimous, overwhelming support from this panel for the Trillion Trees Act, and this committee should fully embrace it because that's exactly what the Trillion Trees Act does. Next, I want to talk about giant sequoias. Mr. Huffman, I think, mentioned that. This chart is shows fires in the giant sequoias. From 1898 to 2014, we averaged 3 fires per century. Previous to that, going back centuries and centuries, we averaged 31 fires per century, one every 3 years. Starting in 2015 to 2021, the number of fires and the intensity of the fires has greatly increased. We lost 20% of our giant sequoias to wildfires because of mismanagement leading up to this time. Does the panel think we should save our giant sequoias? I agree, and there's a way to do it, and too bad we're out of time, or I would tell you.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. And next we'll go to Rep. Nagus, who unfortunately is all too familiar with wildfire destruction. Rep. Nagus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for your leadership and for hosting this important hearing today. The timing of this hearing couldn't be better. Just yesterday, my staff and I had the opportunity to visit with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, which is located at Colorado State University in my district, to learn more about the great work that they and the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes are doing to restore our lands and our forests, particularly after wildfires. For communities in my district, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, the threat of wildfires, of drought, and deteriorating air quality is only worsening. Wildfire seasons are turning into wildfire years, with fires burning in August, in December, and in March. In the last 18 months alone, the largest, second largest, and most destructive fires in Colorado history all occurred in my district, with the devastating Marshall Fire in December destroying over 1,000 homes. And just last weekend, we had another wildfire, the NCAR fire in South Boulder. The cost of climate change for my community could not be more clear. We need bold, decisive action to address these impacts and to tackle these existential threats. Earlier this month, I was proud to join with my colleague, Representative Matsui from California, to launch the Nature and Oceans Task Force of the House Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition. Thank you to my select committee colleagues, Representative Huffman and Representative Bonamici, for joining us in this effort as members of the task force, and I certainly look forward to the important work on those matters. It is time for Congress to take action to mitigate the impacts of these climate fuel disasters, and I'm so glad that we are holding this hearing today to explore some of the ways that we can use natural climate solutions to do just that. Mr. O'Mara, you used one of my favorite phrases in your written testimony, that an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. I have certainly found this to be true in wildfire and forest restoration efforts and in preparing for natural disasters more broadly. I wonder if you might be able to share or perhaps expound more on some of the examples of the cost savings resulting from forest restoration and ecosystem protection efforts, and how those efforts strengthen our lands, our forests, and our oceans against future natural disasters.
Thank you, Congressman. And in the forest space, we see at least like a 1 to 3 cost savings for every dollar we spend on forest restoration. We can avoid $3 to $4 of damage. Some estimates are even much higher than that. And so, we're incredibly bullish and grateful for your leadership on the bipartisan infrastructure package, as well as the forestry package and reconciliation to drive a lot of these investments. And I think it's not a one size fits all. It's got to be ecologically appropriate. It's got to be done in ways that kind of work on the local landscape and work with local communities. But it is a huge cost savings, and it's much cheaper, as as unfortunately folks in Boulder have experienced repeatedly, to have healthier systems earlier as opposed to trying to pick up the pieces afterwards. And so I just think, again, one of the things I'd like to work with all of you on is actually scoring this appropriately, because right now you have to figure out how to pay for that $1 of prevention, where we don't count for the supplemental appropriation you have to pay after the fact, when we could avoid a lot of that damage. And so there's got to be a way to fix that with CBO, because these are savings that are attributing. We're spending, I don't know, $100-200 billion a year on supplemental appropriations. None of that's in the forward-looking debt projections, but it's definitely there. It's definitely real, and we should be investing now because we know we can save those costs tomorrow.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think the point that you raised is a salient one with respect to being cognizant of finding ways to incorporate the costs on the back end, right, as we're making these considerations here in the Congress. The fact that it's a 1 to 3 cost savings is just, it's a fact that I think we lose sight of here in Congress, and that we shouldn't. And certainly my community has not lost sight of that fact in light of the natural disasters that we have experienced in just the last 18 months. So I thank you for the testimony. I thank all of the witnesses for their testimony today. Cognizant perhaps of the votes that have been called, I will yield the balance of my time. But again, we'll thank the witnesses and the chair for her leadership. And I yield back.
Thank you, Rep. Naguz, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your very insightful testimony today. All members have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses without objection, and I'll ask the witnesses to respond promptly. Mr. Westerman has asked for unanimous consent to submit into the record 2 reports, one entitled Developments in the Built Environment, November 2020, and Decarbonizing U.S. Buildings from Climate Innovation from July 2018. I believe Rep. Crenshaw also asked for a 2014 staff report from the Senate Republicans Environment and Public Works. So without objection, we will enter that into the record. And I'll also ask unanimous consent for a March 2022 article from the Washington Post titled "The Bogus Allegation That Putin is Funding a California Environmental Charity." It concludes, "For years, it's been clear that Sea Change Foundation has no connection to secret Russian money." With that, I want to thank everyone. We'll remain committed to natural climate solutions to benefit the planet and make sure that we can give our kids and future generations a livable planet to live in. So thank you all. The hearing is adjourned.